thank the Center for Asian Studies, our primary host for tonight, and the co-sponsors, the Department of Economics, Department of Political Science, and the Program on International Affairs. And of course, my thanks to the panelists for coming tonight to share their expertise and perspectives on this very important policy issue. I'm Robert McNown. I'm in the Department of Economics and also affiliated with the Center for Asian Studies. My role is a very pleasant one of just introducing the panel and then turning it over to them. So the format is that the panelists will give their opening remarks for about 10 minutes each, and then a little back and forth among the panel, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions from you. And I'm expecting it's going to be an interesting evening. We've got a variety of perspectives here facing you at the table. And let me introduce them, starting at my immediate right here, Keith Maskus. He's an Arts and Science Professor of Distinction at CU-Boulder. He's been a lead economist in the Development Research Group at the World Bank. He's also a research fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a consultant for the World Trade Organization. He's written extensively on various aspects of international trade, and particularly technology and intellectual property issues. His most recent book, in fact, titled Private Rights and Public Problems, Global Economics of Intellectual Property in the 21st Century. And Keith will be our primary moderator and will kind of set the stage for tonight's discussion. Next to him is Sam Gilchrist. He's the Executive Director of the Colorado AFL-CIO. He's bringing to us over 10 years of experience in politics and labor organization. He's led locals in member-driven organizing drives, legislative fights, and political campaigns at the municipal, state, and federal levels. And he lives in Castle Rock, so I particularly appreciate that he's come all the way from Castle Rock and left his wife and their dog Dublin behind. Next to him is Tyler Rauert. He's a principal at the Polaris Law Group, which is a Colorado-based international law firm. And so his perspective is particularly valuable with its focus on foreign investment, cross-border business transactions, entity formation and funding, corporate governance, which we're going to hear about a lot tonight, I think, and international dispute resolution. Tyler serves as the chair of the World Trade Center, Denver's Trade Policy Committee, and co-chair of the Colorado Bar Association's International Transactions section. And next to him is Jesse Prentice-Dunn, the senior representative from Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. As in that role, he focuses on stopping trade of illegally harvested timber and global deforestation. Jesse has represented the Sierra Club on Capitol Hill since 2007. In addition to working on international trade issues, he also served as the organization's lead transportation policy analyst, helping secure the historical vehicle efficiency standards of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. And Steve Chan is also a college professor of distinction at CU-Boulder. So we have quite a distinguished panel. He's a professor of political science and director of the Farron Residential Academic Program at CU. And his research interests encompass theories of international relations with a focus on East Asia, most appropriate for an event sponsored by the Center for Asian Studies. And his publications include 17 books and 170 articles and chapters. I won't list them all, but most relevant, I think, for tonight is Looking for Balance, China, the United States, and Power Balancing in East Asia, from Stanford University Press in 2012. So I'll turn it over now to Keith to begin the program.
Okay, thank you, Robert. What I'm just going to do is offer some contextual remarks about the TPP. You'll recognize a few things. Take about 10 minutes doing that, and then turn it over to these guys who are very closely involved and will have, I think, strong opinions, and we'll be able to get the discussion going that way. If on occasion you'd like to hear from an economist, a viewpoint or two about these issues, just ask me. I'm happy to jump in there, but I'm trying to avoid too much. So, effects of globalization in 2 slides. Here's the first one. You can read that. So, the left-hand panel there is the share of the so-called G7 countries, the 7 largest industrial countries in the world, whose share of world exports of merchandise peaked at 50-some% in 1991 and has collapsed since that time. It's now going below 30%, a reduction of the world share of exports in some 20 to 30 years of that magnitude is utterly unprecedented. Not that anybody's ever been measuring these things before, but there it is. The right-hand panel there is G7, the same country's world share of gross domestic product. These were the dominating, massive, largest countries, achieving about 2/3 of world GDP as we can measure it by 1989. That's also gone down quite a bit to about half of world GDP. Now, those are really large changes, and they're just indicative of why people are so concerned about the implications of globalization for manufacturing, employment, income inequality, and so on in the OECD countries. So that's one way to think about the impacts of globalization. Here's another. This is the number of people living in absolute poverty, $1 per day or less. This is a long time series, just because that's where I found this chart. But if you look at that, over the long sweep of history, the number of people in poverty went up just because of population increases. But beginning about 1980, 1985, that has plummeted. So the number of people living in real income terms in absolute poverty, as the World Bank essentially defines it, has gone from some 1.4 billion to about 500 million people in, again, 25 or 30 years. That is utterly unprecedented. There has never been anything like that in economic history. And it's an amazing accomplishment that people generally don't understand. Most of that is China, of course, East Asia, Vietnam. But these two charts are very closely related. What has happened, the history of globalization in effect, is that countries like the United States, Europe, and Japan have agreed to open their markets to the introduction into the world labor pool of about 35% more workers than were there 30 years ago. And that has had very substantial impacts. And that's why poverty has diminished around the world. It's an amazing accomplishment. And why manufacturing jobs are under such stress in the United States and Europe at the same time. So how you feel about globalization depends upon which of those charts you prefer, I guess. And of course, there are many other things going on to explain these changes. Most importantly, technological change, which is a big area, a big issue here. But that's just by way of setting the stage. Now let's think about the TPP. What is it? Often this is called the first 21st century mega regional trade agreement. That's what the Obama administration calls it. What does that mean? Well, it covers huge volumes of activity, including both developed and developing countries. So something like 40% of world GDP, something like 30% of world merchandise trade. It involves 6 very wealthy economies and 6 other economies that range from quite poor, Vietnam, to emerging economies like Mexico and Chile. There is interest expressed to join this thing pretty quickly by Korea, Philippines, Thailand, and Taiwan, maybe China and Hong Kong. I hope Steve has some things to say about that, or you guys do. What do you think about that? This agreement engages in very extensive cuts in trade barriers. Something like 18,000 tariff lines are being reduced. That is, their tariff, the taxes on imports are being cut. in many cases to zero almost overnight in these East Asian economies. It's a remarkably liberalizing agreement. There'll be more market access in agriculture and textiles and apparel. Now we're getting into the more difficult stuff. This agreement covers substantive areas far beyond trade in goods to include very extensive regulatory issues, such as liberalization of investment restrictions, opening up of the services markets, intellectual property rights, government procurement, which is the issue of what government rules are in terms of how they have to accept contracting if they're going to sell or if they're going to be buying some products or services. And these sets of countries will be much more open to competition from abroad in their government procurement, at least at the central federal level. State-owned enterprises, rules on corruption, many other things we could talk about. There is an enforceable dispute resolution mechanism. And finally, this agreement covers issues of social concern with enforcement provisions for the first time in a major trade agreement, so including labor standards and environmental protection somewhat more weakly. But just to give you a sense of how extensive some of this stuff is, here's a chart about the changes over time in U.S. free trade agreements, bilateral and plurilateral, and now very large one with the TPP, in how they have treated labor rights. If you look at NAFTA, basically, and what was going on in these agreements through the 2000s, basically no change. There were always short little chapters in there saying that labor standards are important and you should enforce them, but nothing much other than that. Since 2010, there's been a much broader or much more rigorous emphasis on this issue. And then in 2015, 2016 with the TPP, all of these things are included in the labor rights chapter of the TPP. So depending again how you look at that thing, this is either something that the corporations are really going to hate and progressives will really like, or it's a trade agreement and progressives are going to dislike it no matter what. But I think from the standpoint of trade policy, this is an enormous change in global trade policy. Why, this is my last slide, why is this thing so controversial? Well, first of all, economists, very good economists, estimate that the TPP will generate for the United States something like an additional $357 billion in exports over what they will be otherwise by the year 2030, and maybe $131 billion in real income, about 0.5% of GDP. That may not sound like much, 0.5% of GDP, but in an environment when our growth rate struggles to get above 2 or 2.2% per year in the long trend going forward, that's a very large benefit. So why are there so many concerns raised about this thing? Well, of course, as always, with any large trade agreement, there'll be concerns about more offshoring of jobs, lost employment, declining wages. To put this starkly, that $131 billion in extra income may go to the top 5% of the people in this economy. It's quite possible, but that's what will happen here. We don't know. We hope not, but there may be more income inequality that's generated. The issue that I'm sure will be discussed at some length here, investor-state dispute settlement. I'm not going to say much about that. It's really wonky, really fast. And if you want to spend an afternoon sleeping, then I suggest you read this chapter of the TPP and see what it actually says. But many argue that these provisions amount to a restraint on national sovereignty to regulate things like public health. Very strong intellectual property protection, something that I know quite about. But you can ask yourself, is it sensible for countries like Vietnam and Malaysia to be adopting these regulations in pharmaceuticals, digital products, biologics, and some other areas as well? Limits on procurement, limits on policies, I should say, in procurement, state-owned enterprises, and forms of industrial policy are in this agreement, and some would argue that that will remove a pro-development toolkit for those economies I can tell you that these issues in particular are very likely aimed at opening up the Chinese market if and when China decides to join the TPP. And finally, you can ask, do these labor and environmental protections go far enough? Like I said, they're pretty remarkable in the fact that they're unprecedented in an agreement of this kind, but nevertheless, many people would like to see them be even stronger than they are. So I'm going to stop at that point and turn it on to, so why don't we start with Sam?
Oh boy.
And
All
do you
right.
have your slides in here?
I do. I have a slideshow. So,
Getting fancy.
yeah. You know, it's funny, we're in this building. So in college, I studied anthropology and political science, and we're in an anthropology building. Well, you know, saw several classrooms. And part of my task in many of these panels has been to bring sort of the human aspect to this. You know, we can talk about the numbers, we can talk about the growth in GDP, we can talk about the total, you know, dollars generated for our economy, but I think we often fail to look at the impact that past free trade agreements have had on many of our towns. And you know, I would be dishonest in saying that the, you know, labor community and many of our partners in the environmental community and elsewhere are anti-trade. We're not anti-trade, but what we tend to look for more is fair trade as opposed to free trade. And so I'm going to go through a few things. Some of it may be a little repetitive, but let's just see. So this is just a little thing we put together. This is for general audiences, so you know, it might not be as academic, but hopefully it's still informative. I have a quick video here, if it will play. Here we go. Thank you.
That was a simple answer.
TPP está siendo negociado a puertas cerradas.
TPP could mean more corporate influence over my government's economic policy.
TPP could mean that I feel less secure.
TPP could mean that global corporations pit worker against worker in a race to the bottom.
TPP nos haría más difícil organizar a los trabajadores.
TPP could mean fewer work opportunities for local residents.
El TPP significaría menos dinero para cubrir las necesidades de mi familia. TPP significaría tener medicamentos más caros.
TPP could mean companies write my country's food labels and safety standards.
TPP significaría comida nociva y contaminación ambiental.
TPP is a trade and globalization agreement between 12 countries. And even after negotiations are finished, more countries can join.
TPP can make it harder to organize workers.
TPP could mean deforestation.
TPP could mean more overfishing.
El TPP pourrait vouloir dire que notre voix ne sera plus écoutée.
Este acuerdo transpacífico es una gran prueba para las posibilidades futuras de la población mundial.
TPP could mean we lose our voice.
Workers' rights, environmental protection, access to medicines. We urge you to ensure that the agreement will be balanced and centered on people's needs, not simply the needs of corporations.
TPP is going to happen.
TPP va a pasar.
TPP is going to happen unless you do something about it.
TPP será una realidad si no hacemos algo.
So that was, as you can tell, put together by our national AFL affiliate. And as you probably noticed, it came out before the TPP text was released. So I think knowing that, as we move on, how do I click forward in this? So you know the TPP is a trade deal. We'll move forward through that. What I want to talk about is the impact that past free trade agreements have had. Much of the positive analysis of the TPP assumes income and labor remain constant. And unfortunately, this assumption is unrealistic because we can't predict the future. And we've talked, in the last panel we were a part of, we talked a lot about global policy models and the UN's global policy model in terms of gauging the impact of the TPP. It recognizes that the labor and income share has decreased every year since the 80s. We can assume that much of this decrease is a result of deregulation and bad trade policies like NAFTA. So the TPP, in our opinion, only further decreases, causes further decreases in labor and income shares for the U.S., which drives down wages and increases inequality. So in some ways, you could think of it as we're exporting prosperity. That in the global sense, I don't think is a bad thing. We should be looking to increase wages and benefits and working standards and human rights standards in foreign countries. I think that is a part of the global economic leaders, or the G7, G8 countries, if you will. Part of it, it's made it easier to offshore jobs in the past. It's empowered global firms with special legal rights, but really no obligations, much like you see in the ISDS. And so we see it just causing sort of a race to the bottom. Is anyone here from the Midwest? Yeah. So remember home. That's probably why you're here. I'm from Indiana. So, but this isn't about trade versus no trade. It's about, our opposition is about the fact that this is really untested. We've seen the impact of these in the past, and that's what scares us the most. So who benefits from this? Is it the workers in this country that benefit? Does it drive up our median income? Past free trade agreements show that it doesn't. Are the workers in foreign countries the ones who benefit from this? That could be the case. It also could not be the case. As you saw in the video and as has been alluded to, countries can join this essentially or benefit from the tenets of the TPP without actually signing on to the side letters, much like China can benefit from some of the benefits of the TPP. So in terms of past free trade agreements, I think it's important to point out some of the impact to Colorado. Colorado lost about 15,476 manufacturing jobs, or about 10.1% during the NAFTA WTO period. And this is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this is a figure for total manufacturing employment. Overall, about 72,000 jobs were lost in Colorado as a result of the NAFTA agreement. So you can see that trade, the increase, trade agreements such as this do increase exports, but they also export jobs. As you can see, the workers' share of our national income is significantly shrinking, which is rising inequality. I'm sure we've all heard about, the 99% or versus the 1%. This is exactly that. And this is non-farm labor share, just so you're aware. This decline has directly impacted, or is directly correlates to the decline in organized workers in this country as well. But this isn't just happening here. So I think it's important that we compare the workers' share of national income to other countries, because we say, oh, that's just the U.S., we're isolationist if we don't want to be a free trade country. It's declined significantly. If you look at South Korea, which is considered one of the most prosperous countries in the world, it's declined from almost 95% to just above 70% within the last 40 years. Mexico, which is often considered an emerging economy, has saw its peak really around in the mid 70s and has decreased as a result. They're a NAFTA country. So I think it's important to think about how this actually impacts the people living there and who benefits from it. Is it the wealthiest people in a country that benefit from free trade agreements? I would say yes, and I think that that's unfair to the majority of the population in places. So as you can see, the rules have really helped detach worker productivity from wage increases. It's a little crazy if you look at the chart. You see right around the the end of the 60s, things really started to shift, or the beginning of the 70s, I should say. Our median income in the U.S. has been stagnant for the last 35, 40 years. We are now, our minimum wage in this country is lower, or the last equivalent in terms of, or I'm sorry, the 1968 minimum wage had a greater purchasing power than it does today. And also, you know, as the middle class, you know, share of aggregate income declines, so as the decline in labor union participation. The interesting fact, too, is that as this has gotten so bad in this country in so many places that, you know, millennials, which I'm a part of, 18 to 35-year-olds, over 64% support labor unions because, you know, as we're getting out of college with crippling debt, as we're getting into the labor market with poor wages, you know, we're actually witnessing that, you know, maybe we can't have the nice things that our parents provided for us. So this is, I know it's a little dramatic, but I couldn't help myself. So we, as you can see, income inequality over the years, and for, you know, really the, you know, kind of broken down by the top 0.1%, top 0.01%. The richest 20% have a, you know, a disproportionate share of income relative to what they had in the 40s to the 70s, and the top 0.1 and top 0.01% are, I believe, they're it's a 454% rise for the top 0.1% in that period of time. So it's pretty ridiculous. Something else to. Oh, sorry.
Those income figures, are those before tax or after tax income?
I think it's gross family income. So, yeah. I don't know if we took into account the tax code or the tax scales. So that's a debatable point. So as you can see, things have really changed. You know, NAFTA, if you like NAFTA, you like the TPP. This is, you know, the NAFTA costs the U.S. over 700,000 jobs. It's undermined labor and environmental protections in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, contributed to increasing inequality. So one of the things that we have to look at in terms of free trade versus fair trade are the standards of the countries involved. Do we just enter into an agreement with a country with no enforceable provisions in terms of human rights standards, labor standards, wage standards, or do we require that they improve those standards prior to our entering into an agreement? Fair trade would suggest that we bargain and enter into agreements with countries or corporations who take these things into account, who seek to improve their standards prior to entering into a trade agreement. As I'm sure Jesse will point out, the words climate change don't appear in the document at all. There are vast human rights violations in a number of the developing countries that we're entering into an agreement with. But another big thing is that we've touched on, and which we'll get into more, is the interstate dispute settlement. This is a real problem for us in the United States, because what it does is it allows countries to sue the U.S. if they disagree or if our policies impact their profits. So a foreign corporation can sue the United States if they believe that some policy we have, whether that's a labor standard, whether that's an environmental standard, here in the U.S., they deem it to impact their profit margin. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But I can't stress enough the increase in inequality that free trade agreements create. So this is really talking about the new members that we're dealing with. There's no margin for error in terms of our enforcing the provisions within the TPP or making sure that other countries are held to that standard. And it's also difficult to amend. Once we get into an agreement, it ultimately takes another free trade agreement, much like this will amend some of the provisions in NAFTA. It generally takes another agreement to do the same thing. Am I? Okay. So I will run through. I'll get into ISDS. Another big problem with the TPP is the fact that it was negotiated in secret for a very long time. And although many environmental, human rights, labor organizations offered suggestions or policy changes, many of them were largely ignored. So let me get into a quick about ISDS. What's my time? Am I over already?
No, we'll take another couple minutes.
Okay, it's that damn video. So,
blame the workers.
I know.
Right.
Thanks, Tyler.
Well done.
So ISDS is a real issue. It allows foreign countries to bypass U.S. law through international courts. 3 judges determined by the party. And Tyler, if you can clarify who actually determines which judges, who decides who the judges are. I can't remember if it's the corporation that's waging or if it's a mutual agreement. Yep. So basically, in the past, the most recent period of free trade, NAFTA. Let's just use NAFTA as an example. Major corporations have launched over 550 cases against 95 governments throughout, through similar trade pacts. An example, and I'll just provide 2 quick examples. One is country of origin labeling. In June 2015, Congress voted to remove country of origin labels on meat products after Canada and Mexico brought suit against us through NAFTA. So
it was WTO.
Oh, it was through WTO. All right, well, thank you. So, and currently TransCanada is suing the United States over the Keystone XL pipeline. So they're seeking about $15 billion in retribution, which is taxpayer money. So most proponents of the TPP argue that the U.S. has never lost a suit. But as those examples show, we generally settle or we change our laws, we amend our laws to allow those changes to increase. Quickly, lost jobs, lower wages. Higher drug costs are a big problem. The expansion of patent protections for pharmaceutical companies up to 100 years could virtually eliminate generic drugs, which would profoundly impact seniors. A lot of groups that we tend to turn to for advice on those things like AARP, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders are against TPP. We're also worried about procurement policies in terms of Buy American, Buy Colorado, if you will. The TPP could force states to ignore those policies, even if they've been law, or our country if they've been law. That could impact our military manufacturers. It could impact our pharmaceutical companies. It could impact any advanced manufacturing that we have going on in the country. And I will move on. So these are just some other TPP threats: deregulation of banks, food safety and product safety rules. Foreign subsidized companies behave in a predatory manner, allowing them to wage lawsuits against the U.S. And then I won't even get into currency manipulation because I'm already well over. But I'll leave you with a quote, and I'll use this one. This is actually from CWA. They did a study of over 2,600, well, I shouldn't say a study, a survey of over 2,600 workers throughout the country. And what they saw is the impact of the TPP on their lives. So Patrick Odell from Harrisonville, Missouri, Midwestern state that's been impacted through a lot of outsourcing, a lot of offshoring of jobs, had some words. So I'll leave you with his words instead of mine, and let us move on to Tyler, or whoever we decide.
Yeah, Tyler.
Okay. Well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a 6,000 word trade agreement. And there is no way that we can talk about a 6,000 word agreement or 6,000 page agreement in 10 minutes. So I'm not even going to try, right? I'm just going to focus on one specific issue that I think has become the locus of a lot of, it's sort of become the lightning rod for a lot of the controversy around the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that is what Sam mentioned briefly, investor-state dispute settlement. Investor-state dispute settlement. ISDS, it's found in the investment chapter. There are two reasons that I'm going to do that. One is because it is so controversial now. The second is because I'm a lawyer and this is what I do. I practice in this area. One of the things I've noticed with TPP in particular and trade policy more broadly is that people feel very comfortable speaking about this outside their area of expertise. They have a lot of opinions that aren't necessarily backed up by a lot of facts. Both in favor and against, right? And what I want to do with you all is be intellectually honest about one area where I can offer some expertise and maybe we can make some headway on working through one small piece of this agreement. So I'm going to do a few things. One is talk to you briefly about what is investor-state dispute settlement, also called ISDS, also called investor-state arbitration, because God forbid we be clear on anything. What are the problems with it? What we can do about it, and put this whole discussion in some context, and do all of that in now 9 minutes. So we'll give it a shot. And I don't have a video to help me out, so bear with me. All right, so what is investor-state dispute settlement? Let's start with what it is not. It is not litigation. It is not what you typically think of as a court case where there's a judge and two sides presenting their arguments with the possibility of appeal if the judge gets the law wrong. It is also not state-to-state dispute resolution like in the World Trade Organization. That's the country of origin labeling dispute that Sam mentioned. In that case, the country of Mexico and the country of Canada sued the United States in Geneva because we instituted a law where you had to label the country where your beef came from. And that had to do with some, I think it was bad beef coming from Mexico and Canada. I don't remember the exact stuff. But it was countries suing other countries about restraints on trade. Had nothing to do with investors. All right. What it's also not is private party arbitration. I write this into every business contract that I do across borders. Private parties quite often do what's called international commercial arbitration, where they agree to have some institution hear their case rather than go through the court system. And they agree there's not going to be any appeals, and they agree whatever the arbitrators decide, that's it, we call it good. So it's not that either. So what is it? It's a special procedure that we find in about 3,000 international trade and investment agreements since 1957. This is not new. This has been around for over 50 years. It's found mostly in bilateral investment treaties. So the US and Turkey, for instance, have a bilateral investment treaty with this procedure in it. It's found in the investment chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that's chapter 9 in the TPP. It's chapter 11 in NAFTA, but I think it's 9 in the TPP. So typically what ISDS has done is it gives investors the ability to skip national courts and bring an arbitration claim. Usually that's at the World Bank, the ICSID facility. It's the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And they can bring an arbitration for a few reasons. They really all break down into two categories. One is expropriation, and the other is discrimination. So those are the two categories. Expectations of profit are not a reason to bring, they're not a way to win an arbitration claim. You can bring a claim for any reason you want. There have been lots of frivolous ISDS claims, but they don't win. So the expectation of profits is specifically targeted in the Trans-Pacific Partnership as not an available reason to initiate an ISDS arbitration. So that's one way, for instance, that the TPP attempts to upgrade NAFTA. So these arbitrations are a panel of, typically, they're a panel of 3 arbitrators. One chosen by the investor, one chosen by the country who the investor is, has a claim against, and then the third arbitrator chosen by the agreement of the first 2 arbitrators. So they have to, the first 2, each party picks one, and then those 2 together pick one. There's always or almost always a procedure to challenge arbitrators of the other side if you think that they can't be impartial. So within, especially ICSID at the World Bank, they have a whole procedure to make sure that arbitrators, at least in theory, are impartial. But these folks are typically, you know, they could be corporate lawyers, they could be retired judges, arbitrators could come from any number of fields. There are several people who do this work in the Denver area. So the intention behind creating this mechanism was to encourage foreign investment by giving foreign investors some expectation of predictability about what would happen to their investments, especially regarding discrimination and expropriation. So I spent the first 10 or 12 years of my career working on rule of law development in countries in the developing world. And I can tell you that that is a tough row to hoe. Most of the countries that I worked in, their judiciaries were not free, they were not fair, they were captured by the executive, highly corrupt, or captured by organized crime. So this happens in a lot of parts of the world, and it's something that we don't really like to think about, but it's real. And investors are much less likely to put money and products in a country where, say, the executive just decides after you've invested X million of dollars, I'm just going to take what you've invested in my country. And oh yeah, that you can file your suit, but it doesn't matter because the judge is beholden to me, so you're going to lose. So thank you very much for your investment. So that's the reason behind it. Investors often see this ISDS procedure as a critical risk mitigation tool to move capital from the developed world into the developing world. But there are a lot of problems with this, okay? So let's be honest about what the problems with this procedure are. First is that the evidence on whether these trade and investment treaties actually impact decisions on whether to invest, where to invest, are inconclusive. Some say yes, some say no. We don't really know the answer, if we're going to be honest. But ISDS does have an impact on the rule of law, especially in destination countries. And the US is the world's largest foreign direct investor. And if we do if Congress ratifies the TPP, we will then become one of we're already the world's largest also target of foreign direct investment. Most countries invest here, and America is the biggest single investor out. So ISDS matters to us, both within our system and what impact we have on other legal systems. So one of the problems with ISDS is access. Foreign investors, this is a special right just for foreign investors. States don't have access to it. Other business people within that country don't have access to it. So the government can expropriate domestic investments, and those people have no resource. But a foreign investor actually gets special rights over a domestic investor. NGOs don't have access to it. States can't initiate a claim. Only the investor can initiate the claim. And the investor can initiate a claim both, if they so choose, in the arbitration panel and in the domestic courts. So this is what's happened with TransCanada. TransCanada has started a federal lawsuit, sort of regular run-of-the-mill federal lawsuit in the US, and they've also initiated a NAFTA claim. And the worry is that they're going to basically see which one is going better and go with that one. So that's a forum shopping that's available to TransCanada because they're Canadian. That's not available, for instance, if one of my clients wanted to sue the US government. All right. That said, states usually win these claims, About a third of them are settled. Of the remaining 2/3, states on average win about 2/3 of those, and the investors win about a third of the remainder. So it's tough for an investor to win one of these claims. Another problem with it is substantive rights. To make a long story very short, because the law of one of these arbitrations is the law of the treaty and not the law of the state where the investment takes place, foreign investors can be treated substantively differently than other potential claimants. So there's sort of a two-tier system of law in addition to a two-tier access system, which could be problematic. All right. I'm going to move to, there's some procedural legitimacy questions about arbitral tribunals. These are usually staffed by, each arbitrator only works on a case-by-case basis. These aren't sort of tenured judges that do these things. And frankly, there's no practical appellate mechanism. If the arbitrators get the law wrong, you're just screwed. Right, like, as a general rule, that's just how it works with a lot of these arbitrations. Now, thankfully, that doesn't happen often, but it can happen, right? So that's a problem. And the final potential issue is regulatory chill, right? So what this comes down to is basically many of the investment agreements where ISDS is found are focused, because they're investment agreements, on protecting investment, and they don't typically address labor concerns, environmental concerns, human rights issues, right? The TPP is attempting to address some of that. There's debate over whether it goes far enough, but that's one of the concerns, is that because there's this focus on protecting investor rights, and then these investors get this special procedure and potentially special laws applied to them, that you might see states decide not to regulate in the public interest because they're worried about their liability. We don't have any evidence that that's actually the case, though. In fact, if a state loses an ISDS decision, they can keep their law the same. They just have to pay damages to the company, to the investor. And they would, in theory at least, only have to pay those damages if they illegally expropriated property or discriminated against the investor because they are foreign. So those are some of the issues. Now, the TPP attempts to correct this by emphasizing the right to regulate in the public interest. So the TPP tries to upgrade NAFTA, as well as our trade agreement with Chile, with Peru, with Singapore. Our one with Australia doesn't have an ISDS provision. All right, so what do we do with the TPP with this ISDS question looming out there? So frankly, there's no room to renegotiate now. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is what it is. It's ready for an up or a down vote, as is, no changes, right? We either take it as it is or we leave it. So that basically comes down to whether you, on balance, think that the ISDS provisions are a reason to get rid of the whole deal, if they're bad enough to leave the whole deal. Now, as someone who practices in this area of law, I can tell you that it is very important to me how this works. But it is not very important to most investors, nor to most states, because so few investments ever come to a dispute with a state. Sam mentioned something like 500 disputes that went to ISDS tribunals. That sounds like a lot over, only a few decades. But look at how many cases are in our federal court system, right? Many, many more. Or how many firms are actually investing in foreign countries. It dwarfs the size of investor disputes. So when you actually kind of run the numbers on these things, the impact of investor-state dispute settlement is vanishingly small. It just is. It's a great talking point. It really scares people to talk about a corporate court where there's all of these, lawyers who wear suits, guys who look like me doing evil things. But in general, that's not what happens. It can happen, right? Philip Morris tried to sue Australia to stop its plain labeling rules on cigarettes, but that case got thrown out as soon as it could. the arbitration panel said, no, you don't have a case here. We'll see what happens with TransCanada. I'm very interested in an ISDS case where a U.S. wind turbine manufacturer is suing Ottawa, the government, well, actually, it's a state-owned enterprise in Ottawa, about pulling the plug on a sustainable energy plan that they had promised to this firm, and now they're saying, oh, no, we're not going to fulfill our promises to you. So I'll be interested in that because I think that sort of hits the environmental question from the reverse side. It's typically the environmental objection to ISDS is that states will implement environmental restrictions that might stop, especially extractive industries, from doing things that they expected to be able to do. But this sort of works in the other direction, where you have a state promising renewable energy subsidies to a firm and then taking those away. So it's sort of a state being anti-environmental rather than pro-environmental. And I think that sort of sends the whole thing into a tizzy. So I just got the hook. There are some things that we can do in the future. I'll be happy to talk about how we can make this better. I've talked to Sam briefly about this in the past. I think, for instance, labor unions and environmental NGOs should also have access to the ISDS system so that we broaden access to it. We also help enforcement that way. There's some other things that we can do. I would just close with one quick point. If you are in fact worried about investor-state dispute settlement as a problem for the United States, then you should be heavily in favor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Because our current ISDS system with NAFTA, with Singapore, with every other country that we have a free trade agreement with, is flawed in many of these ways. The TPP is an upgrade and is an improvement over those. It does address some of the concerns that I raised. So if you are concerned about ISDS, I would argue that you actually should be in favor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership because of the upgrade that it provides. So I'll close with that.
So we'll move on to Jesse, but just very quickly on that subject. If you don't know this, Tyler mentioned the plain paper packaging tobacco requirement. Tobacco has been carved out of the TPP altogether. The tobacco industry no longer has access to the ISDS procedure.
Yeah, and that was a giant middle finger to Philip Morris from all 12 governments.
You can thank Australia for that.
Yeah, right. What's that?
But I think that's also an admission that corporations can use this tool for pretty nefarious purposes. And so if a tobacco company can do it, who says an oil company can't do it? So I'll attempt to cover the environment, which is a giant topic.
Good luck with that.
I know. As Keith mentioned at the beginning, this is a huge trade deal that's going to spur a lot of trade and a lot of products, agricultural, palm oil, fish, all sorts of stuff all across the Pacific Ocean. And all of that has environmental impacts, whether it's deforestation, or loss of habitats, or even ship emissions or fuel burn from that. First, I want to talk about process, how we got here in the first place. Tyler mentioned we have an up or down vote. We can take it or leave it. And how did that happen? This agreement was negotiated largely in secret over 5 years, and the Obama administration asked Congress to pass something called Fast Track Authority, basically saying, all these other countries we're negotiating with aren't going to think we're giving our best answer unless you, Congress, give up your ability to amend it. So what we want you to do is pass something with some goals, what you want to see out of the agreement, and then commit to giving it just an up or down vote. No special markups, no amendments, just one floor vote, up or down. While they were negotiating that agreement over those 5 years, there were lots of corporate advisors that had access to this text and able to give input. We're talking folks like Halliburton, Exxon, Anadarko. Not as much with environmental NGOs. You know, we'd present at the public forums that the U.S. Trade Representative would allow for, but we weren't given any special access to text. So that's where we are now. We have an up or down vote, an agreement that's been crafted with the input of corporations, not so much the people. Now, during that, the administration said this is going to be the most progressive trade deal in history. The environmental protections are going to be awesome. Just trust us. it's President Obama after all. Like, he's the best thing since sliced bread, so just trust us. So recently, after those years of negotiation, we got to see the text. Once they actually signed the agreement and said, hey, we're done. It's all wrapped up and finished. Here's what we agreed on. And when we got that text and looked through it, it was pretty disappointing. What we had asked for as environmentalists was a lot of provisions that would be enforceable protections for wildlife and plants and ecosystems. And what we got was a lot of toothless stuff. So instead of saying that countries shall or must implement laws that protect wildlife, it just said, oh, you should pass measures to combat or make efforts to do this. One big issue a lot of people care about is shark finning, right? This is a terrible practice where you catch a shark, cut its fin off. It's used in a lot of soups and foods across the Pacific Rim, leaving the shark to die. It's a big problem that a lot of people care deeply about. And instead of saying the country should pass a rule to prohibit this terrible practice, it just said, literally, quote, countries should pass measures to promote the long-term conservation of sharks, and then lists a whole list of policies that they should do. Doesn't mean they have to. So a lot of what you think of as stereotypically environmental issues, we see as a lot of toothless kind of aspirational language, nothing that's really enforceable. Second, Tyler did, I think, a really admirable job of talking about ISDS from both sides, talking about the nitty-gritty of it. As he mentioned, this is investors suing countries, and by investors, we mean corporations. So I'm not a corporate trade lawyer. I don't want to go too far outside of my bounds, but I would want to talk about a few examples of how this has been used under NAFTA. So one in particular that is concerning has been brought by Lone Pine Resources. It's a gas company out of Canada. They had holdings under the St. Lawrence Seaway. They wanted to frack for natural gas under that. Local jurisdiction said, we're worried about health impacts. Let's put a timeout, a moratorium on that fracking. Lone Pine then started a subsidiary in Delaware and turned around from Delaware and sued Canada. So I know that this was a situation where we're talking about expected future profits, and this is what Tyler said the TPP would avoid. However, as Tyler probably knows, there are a lot of hooks within this mechanism that you can sue under. TransCanada with Keystone is saying it didn't get a minimum standard of treatment. The U.S. discriminated against us because we're Canadian. Another case under NAFTA, the Ethel Corporation, a U.S. chemical company that made a gasoline additive that was supposed to replace lead. That gasoline additive was found to be a neurotoxin. Could be bad for your health. And Canada banned the import of that neurotoxin into Canada. That corporation sued, won. Canada removed the ban and had to pay $13 million in penalties to them. One more, a company called the Bilcon Corporation trying to build a gravel mine near the Bay of Fundy in Canada. The local community rejected the environmental assessment, said it was going to harm a lot of their tourist industry, could harm endangered species. Gravel industry won. They're asking for $300 million. So these are kind of tangible ways that this can be used. And I'd also mention in 2014, 40% of all cases brought under this mechanism were around oil and gas extraction, mining, a lot of energy stuff. So this is an environmental issue. Two other quick things. One, right now, when you want to export natural gas from the United States, if you want to build an LNG facility on the coast, you got to get 2 approvals from the government. From the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they have to approve your site, your plan, your facility, make sure the nuts and bolts work. And then the Department of Energy has to say whether exports of that gas to a certain country are in our national interest. It's a great way to step back, assess the situation, and say, should we be doing this? Back in the 90s, a little provision in, I believe it's the Natural Gas Act, said if we have a free trade agreement with another country, exports of natural gas to that country are automatically deemed in our national interest. That's a big deal, as Japan is one of the biggest importers of LNG. We're about to negotiate another free trade deal with the European Union, and they're huge importers of LNG. So this is an issue where if we're going to frack for gas in the United States, build LNG terminals to ship it abroad where gas is more expensive for higher profits, we think that the government should be able to determine whether those exports are in our national interest. Lastly, and we can talk about this more in questions, you can learn from history and how past trade deals have been enforced. And from the environmental perspective, there's been a troubling history of inaction. One of our more recent trade deals with Peru was also dubbed, one of the most progressive trade deals in history, had 8 solid pages of protections against illegal logging and deforestation. Some of my colleagues 4 years ago said, we've got information about specific ships going out of Peru that have illegal logs. Generally, 80% of the wood coming out of Peru is illegal, been harvested illegally. So we asked the U.S. Trade Representative, hey, can you check that out using your new tool? Like, we know this is illegal. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to work with Peru to improve their forest governance, but we're not going to take a look. And 2 years later, the same companies are importing the same wood. There have been investigative reports showing the same actors shipping wood up to the United States. And I would say now, and this is a good thing, right as they're asking Congress to take a vote on it, the U.S. Trade Rep is starting to investigate some claims. I counted, it was 2,581 days since the deal was enacted. But this is a case where folks are dragging their feet. It's not like we're using these tools for good. So I guess I'll close with that, but just note that from an environmental perspective, and this is a very general thing, I don't think we should just take what we're given because it's a slight improvement. I mean, that's like going from an F to a D. It's still not great. Yeah, from our perspective, we need a new system of trade that protects communities and doesn't necessarily put the rights of corporations first.
Steve? Well, thank you. You all have heard some very reasonable concerns, legal, environmental, employment concerns that could be brought about by the TPP. My take is even worse than you think. It's not even about trade. It's not even about trade. Let me stand back a little bit. It was reported that when Bill Clinton ran for the presidency the first time, he had a banner in his campaign office headquarters in Arkansas, and it says, "It's the economy, stupid." And as a political scientist, I'm going to turn it around and say it's politics, stupid. It's not even about trade. One question even economists want to ask, and it's an empirical question, is does TPP create more trade, or it's really a mechanism that results in trade diversion? Is it trade creation or trade diversion? Robert asked me to talk about the Asian perspective on this TPP, and my response is that there's not uniform Asian perspective. In fact, the geography of this treaty is somewhat revealing, informative. There is more or less, it's not exact, but more or less a split between maritime Asia and continental Asia. And the elephant in the room is China. And China is conspicuous by its absence. You may or may not know that of the 7 members of the treaty, TPP, China is the #1 trade partner for 7 of them. China is the #1 trade partner for Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, Australia, and even the United States for the last 3 months of 2015, when China overtook Canada as the #1 trade partner for the United States. And China happens to be the #2 trade partner for 4 of these members, namely Canada, Peru, Mexico, New Zealand, and China is #3 for Brunei. So from the perspective of China, this is not a treaty for trade. It is an anti-Chinese coalition. China is deliberately being kept out. It's not whether China will likely join. China is not wish to be joined. You want to keep it out. Every act of trade agreement. It's an act of inclusion for those who are invited in, and it is also an act of exclusion for those who are not invited. So, whether or not the Chinese are paranoid, they feel that they are in the eye of a firestorm. That they are something that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders can agree on. For the Democrats, China is an abuser of human rights. And for the Republicans, China is a military menace. And so happens that even for a liberal President Obama, China is used as a way to push through the TPP. In his request to the Congress of the United States to pass the fast-track authorization, he said publicly that if the United States was not part of this agreement, then China would be allowed to determine the rules of the road. And of course, context also requires that we think about what happened to the AIIB, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, when the United States lobbied very heavily, urged all its allies not to join, and it turns out that this effort was not successful except for Japan. All the other major U.S. allies joined the AIIB. So the question is really whether or not we are seeing the opening shot, if you may allow me to say this, opening shot of a darker age, or the return to the Cold War era. That this is just the initial move, rather than a further step in liberalizing international political economy. Now, having said that, let me just conclude by this. I come to you humbled and humiliated. And I say this because 6 months ago, my son, who was an IA major at CU, told me that Donald Trump will get the Republican nomination. And I said, no way. As a political scientist, I can tell you, no way. And so take my proposition, my hypotheses, with a grain of salt.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
So it's not even about trade.
I'm with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, and we've actually been working against the TPP for the last couple of years. And I wanted to respond to the trade lawyer, which is to say that, there's a little bit of denigration of the people who are raising concerns about the investor-state mechanism. And I just want to say that people have done a very extensive analysis of the investor-state and disagree with what you said. And if people are interested in this, go to Public Citizen and look under the TPP and you'll find the analysis of the investor-state chapter. Lawyers disagree on this. 100 lawyers from Alliance for Justice say that this is a threat to democracy. The state legislators, the Conference of State Legislators say they would not support any trade agreement that has investor-state dispute in it. So, your expertise as a lawyer doesn't necessarily mean that you're unbiased in your assessment of this.
Right. There's one group in particular that I would point you to, and that's the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. They do a very good job. They're, unlike sort of the advocacy groups who, I understand why they're doing what they're doing, but the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment does a very good job of really digging into investor-state dispute settlement. Now, they're very much opposed to it, right? They think that that it undermines democracy as well. But I respect their analysis. So if people are interested, go take a look at some of the work that they've done. It's not journalistic in nature, but it's very thorough. Now, I will say that most of the objections to ISDS have come to the forefront only recently. This is an issue that's been around for 57 years, and only with the rise of the Trans-Pacific Partnership has it become a political issue. So I question why that is. Why now? Why raise this issue now? Unfortunately, I think it's become conflated with other opposition to trade and investment, which is understandable, right? If you're opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, maybe as Jesse said, for environmental reasons, I can understand that. We can respectfully disagree. But I would say that the ISDS debate, because it is so complicated, has been it's been taken into the anti-trade coalition, and it's being discussed in a way that's, I don't think, terribly helpful, because it doesn't really honestly analyze both sides of the issue. Most of the advocates that I've seen, both in favor and against, don't acknowledge the good points of the other side and really say, well, on balance, is this an issue that should be the determinative of whether we are in favor of this particular trade deal or opposed to it? Or, maybe more accurately, what are the things that what are the alternatives to it? It's one thing to oppose something and not offer an alternative. What alternatives are being offered? And that's, one of the things where I got a long list of alternatives that would fix a lot of the problems and still get us a trade deal. So I think that the problem isn't so much with the mechanism itself, but with how it's been conflated with opposition to trade more broadly.
Could you give an example? The alternatives are not in the TPP. What's in the TPP are the investor state tribunals, which will give enormous power to multinational corporations to overturn laws through these tribunals.
Let me give you an example of a case that I am playing a small role in now. Colorado farmer invests in Moldova because he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Moldova. He was an agriculture sort of volunteer. He thought he could do something to improve the agriculture sector in Moldova. Once his investment was in place, he'd purchased equipment, he'd moved it over there, he bought land actually leased land in Moldova. Local organized crime got wind of what he was doing, wanted to take his investment, strong-armed the local judiciary into essentially expropriating this person's property. Now there's just been an investor-state dispute settlement filed with ICSID in the World Bank because this fellow he's exhausted his remedies in Moldova. He's not going to get his investment back. It was a clear expropriation of an investment in that country. Now, that's not the TPP. It's a bilateral investment treaty between the United States and Moldova, but that is exactly the kind of case that the ISDS provisions were intended to deal with, and that is not a large multinational corporation. That's a farmer from Colorado. So these things can be framed in terms of large companies trying to bully developing countries. I get that argument, but that simply ignores these other cases where, in fact, for this farmer from Colorado, this ICSID, this ISDS tribunal is his only way to try to get justice. It's the only option he's got. So I guess I would say we need to be careful about whether we're talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
It seems to me the survival of complex civilization depends on us discriminating against fossil fuels worldwide. And so it seems to me this could be a tool to just keep us on the global heating treadmill to our eventual demise. Are my fears granted? Should I be fearful or not? I don't really know. I'm not an expert on this TPP.
Well, the only thing I'd offer for this is Tyler was talking earlier about flipping the notion of the ISDS on its head. And what if somebody sued over a pro-environmental thing? And a development on that recently happened where under the WTO, so a country suing a country, not with a corporation, the United States sued India over a program it had to develop its solar energy resources. Basically saying you're advantaging Indian solar companies and workers too much, U.S. companies can't get a fair shot. Our organization thought that that wasn't a great move, that there are many states within the U.S. that have similar programs to try to incentivize our local solar and wind energies. And so that was kind of a step back for a lot of these good climate solutions. And I bring this up to say, we just had a lot of countries convene in Paris and agree on a goal of how to fight climate change and how to move forward. And that ruling basically said a country's commitments under the UN framework for climate change, just because you're doing something to meet your UN climate goals doesn't mean you can break a trade rule. And from our perspective, that's kind of a dangerous precedent to set. I mean, we're trying to march towards a solution that can help mitigate the effects of climate change, increase renewable energy. And this is a big question of, do trade rules supersede that big priority? So it's an interesting development.
Yeah.
Dennis?
I'm going to ask my question towards Steve Chan, but I'm not sure he's the one.
All right.
Finish your dinner first.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure you're the one that should answer it, but your comment prompts the question. So from my reading about TPP, I do get the impression that because we have this up or down vote, it's the implicit sort of alternative is if we don't ratify it, China will benefit or will do something that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. In other words, this excludes China, but if we don't take advantage of this opportunity to exclude them, they're going to take advantage of the opportunity to exclude us or something. And I guess my question is, what would they do? I mean, what is the most dire possibility if we turn it down and China does have an option to do something?
I think, obviously China is a big country. I cannot generalize about, how the Chinese quote unquote think. But the perception is that this is an attempt to reverse the status quo, what is happening right now. As I mentioned, China happens to be the #1 or #2 trade partner for almost all of those 12 countries. So this is an attempt at trade diversion rather than trade promotion.
I should jump in here, actually, because I completely disagree with Steve on this point.
Not Steve, I'm saying the perception, all right? I mean, you can say...
with your interpretation of the perception, I was actually sitting in the foreign ministry in Beijing the day that the negotiations were announced, or the final negotiations on the TPP, and I talked to the people of the Intellectual Property Office there. They're quite excited, and I think the central government of Beijing is interested in negotiating access to the TPP. Do know that if any of those countries do that, that means they are committing themselves to the standards of the TPP. So that will change their rules in a big way on state-owned enterprises, on government procurement, on ISDS, and on and on. And in addition to that, let me say, if they don't join the TPP, and they're free to do that if they in fact meet those standards, which is a big question. I mean, the domestic political economy arrayed against that happening would be very significant in China. But if that doesn't happen, the Chinese are already negotiating another mega regional in Asia called the RCEP. I don't know exactly what that stands for.
Regional Comprehensive Economic Plan.
It would generate free trade among a lot of Asian countries, some of which are in the TPP, some of which are not, including India, that in fact has much lower standards and says nothing about labor, says nothing about the environment, says nothing about state-owned enterprises and all of these other issues. So I think from the standpoint of where the Asian future lies in the context of trade and investment policy, it's either the TPP or it's something else that would be legitimately exclusionary.
Right. And just for the sake of full disclosure, if China would want to join the TPP, it would have to get the agreement of all 12 countries, assuming all 12 ratify. It would have to get the agreement of everybody who's already in the club in order to join the club. So as the club grows, it gets harder and harder for additional folks to get in.
With some back here, I can, sure.
Basically, a lot of our previous trade agreements, we're dealing with countries where U.S. corporations have a lot of investments in those other countries. With the TPP, there are a lot of corporations based in the 11 other countries outside of the United States that have investments within our borders. So is the United States' exposure to these tribunals increasing? And secondly, is the minimum standard of treatment where a corporation can claim discrimination, is that provision broadening? I think that's the question.
Right. Do you want to go first or you want me to go first?
I think we both, I took up a lot of time earlier, so I have to apologize for that first. Two things. Ken, I think, yes, our exposure is increased based on just the sheer magnitude of countries involved. But I also wanted to comment on something. I think the reason why this has become such a political football is because, specifically because of fast track and the fact that we are unable to renegotiate without having to go back to the drawing board and wait another 5 years before enacting a trade agreement, in which time we think China could potentially take advantage of our lack of a trade agreement. But, that's the real problem. I think therein lies the problem. Because of the nature in which this was agreed to or whatever, the nature in which this was negotiated, thank you, it just didn't leave the door open to these criticisms prior to the introduction of the agreement. So, to answer your question of why is ISDS becoming such more of a football in that terms, it's, I think, simply because, one, we're increasing our exposure, and two, because we didn't actually get to talk about it before it was already, quote unquote, a done deal.
Well, except ISDS has been around in other trade deals for 57 years, including NAFTA. So it's not a new issue, right? It's been around. Right. So we've had the opportunity to talk about it. We've just chosen to wait until now to do it. As far as increased exposure goes, as far as more ISDS cases than in the past, CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, did a very good, I think, analysis of investor-state dispute settlement. They track ISDS cases with the number of bilateral investment treaties, and basically what you see is as the number of treaties that include ISDS increase, the number of ISDS disputes increase. So it has increased with the number of agreements which allow for it. So that's not a surprise. As far as increasing U.S. exposure, the U.S. already has free trade agreements with Canada, with Mexico, with Australia, with, I think, New Zealand, with Singapore, with half of the TPP members. When we talk about increasing our exposure under ISDS, we're really talking about Japan. That Japan is the only country that has any meaningful investments in the United States that would then potentially expose us to ISDS. But Japan and the U.S. have extensive investment relationships now. We just resolve our disputes through the regular court system. So it doesn't actually change, I don't think, our exposure, because a Japanese investor now can sue the U.S. government, and if they win, they get damages. Or they can, under ISDS, they could use that avenue as well, and if they win, they get damages. So I don't know that it increases our exposure to the magnitude that you're raising. It does, in fact, increase our exposure, but we're really just talking about Japan here.
Does anybody have a question not involving ISDS?
How about tariffs? Because we talked about tariffs.
Yeah, no kidding. How about labor?
Enormously enriching, and I've enjoyed it a lot. I want to go back to Steve's politics, but actually to approach it differently. And that is to ask about the politics of our own country right now. One thing I haven't gotten somehow out of this is when exactly this up or down vote is supposed to happen, and is there a deadline by which it must happen? That is unclear to me. But is there, when I look at the political climate in this country right now, I think of the three top political figures right now, Trump and the two Democrats, I don't see a single one of them at least supporting this. Publicly, maybe I'm wrong and missing something. Obviously, Sanders doesn't. I think Hillary came out in opposition formally, and I can't imagine Trump would, given certain other positions he's taken. So
why? So the question is why?
We'll change
the question is why the push.
Does this thing stand a chance? And in this political environment we live in, I can't answer that. I can't even know that until I know when it's supposed to happen.
Please tell us the timeline.
July, I think.
Right.
Lame duck.
I'm happy to take a stab. Yeah, and so
it'll be the lame duck.
That's when the common knowledge says it'll be after the election has happened, and when retiring members can go ahead and hold their nose and cast a vote for it. But the politics of this are fascinating. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue. I mean, this is Fast track passed with a majority that was more Republicans than Democrats.
On the second location.
Yeah, because Obama was asking him to do it. I mean, this is like Chamber of Commerce types battling folks. Like Michelle Bachmann was against this because she thought it would interfere with local and state ability to govern themselves. So this is where the ends of both parties kind of wrap around.
Yeah, it's similar to the fight around NAFTA.
Right, and so I would just say that it's really intense. Paul Ryan has said the votes don't exist to pass it right now, so it's kind of in limbo, and that's when everybody says after the election, maybe they'll try.
You'll see USGAO come out with a report in May, I think. That'll start a clock, which will expire conveniently enough right when Congress goes on recess to start campaigning. So you'll see this hit in the lame duck. I cannot imagine this happening anytime before then.
Too many people have waged, I guess what's the way to put it? There's too much writing on this vote for both sides in terms of support and opposition.
Yep.
And similar to NAFTA. You know, I think that's where it is. It's a political football.
So it's in Paul Ryan's hands, basically, as to when to bring it to Congress.
So you should feel very at ease with that.
No, so. I would have one prediction, which is probably wrong, but I suspect that within days after Secretary Clinton winning the nomination or having the nomination guaranteed, she'll find reasons to support this agreement.
Or that they pass it during the lame duck, so she never has to take a position and then can do the T-tip instead.
Let's not turn this into a Bernie Hillary trial.
I don't know. I'd offer only one other thing, and that another byproduct of negotiating this trade deal, kind of in secrecy, mandating an up or down vote, is that it's essentially the worst agreement that you can agree to that'll get 50% plus one of the vote. And it's interesting to me that you have environmental champions that are unhappy with some of the environmental protections, but you also have folks like Orrin Hatch in Utah who doesn't think that big pharmaceutical companies got enough. So they've upset a lot of people.
Which tells you they've done something right. If everybody's pissed off, maybe something's wrong with that.
I'm wondering whether any of the panelists have studied or are familiar with studies that may indicate that NAFTA has really caused a lot of unemployment in Mexico and other countries too, but Mexico in particular, which is then causing people to desperately want to get to this country. So, I'm just wondering whether that's an issue that.
Yeah. I guess that's a question for an economist. In the first many years after NAFTA, there was great stress in the labor markets, I would say, in Mexico. Great stress. Lots of unemployment associated largely with two things. One is the fact that their agricultural sector, highly inefficient compared to the big mechanized systems in the US and Canada. And also that a lot of the smaller scale manufacturing was not competitive within NAFTA either. You did see a fair amount of employment generated along the border, just because of the proximity to the market there. But net migration into the United States is actually zero from Mexico and might even be negative now because the relative economies have changed conditions. We still have a lot of migration coming from Central America. There's no question about that. But the Mexican economy is not actually generating much out-migration in the United States anymore. It's not just because of changes in relative wages, but that's a big part of it. And so I think NAFTA in that context has had, it took a long time, and you can calculate for yourself how to think about that. But in the long term, NAFTA's probably had a positive impact on manufacturing employment and wages in northern Mexico, which is spreading south now. But when NAFTA was negotiated, the pro people thought it would take care of this immigration problem immediately, which was wrong. And I'm certain that NAFTA has had some real difficult implications for the American labor markets, manufacturing in the Midwest, as you were saying. I don't think there's any question about that. And economists underestimated the strength of that problem in the United States.
Well, a lot of small farmers
in Mexico,
southern Mexico, yeah.
Oh yeah, that was where a lot of the stress came from. Absolutely. Yeah.
came here.
So I'll put on my economist hat too. And one difficulty of analyzing the impact of NAFTA on Mexico is that almost simultaneous with the ratification or adoption of the treaty was this devastating financial crisis that hit Mexico as a result of an imbalanced trade and investment policy and expansionary fiscal policy that was financed by money creation and so on, the usual sort of suspects there. And the consequence was a 40 or 50% devaluation of the peso, which had been tied to the dollar, that overnight, all of a sudden, a huge increase in prices and a devastating contraction of the economy, which of course severely impacted wages and employment. So it's very easy just to count up the job losses in Mexico or see what's happened to wages, but to blame that on NAFTA, you can't really do that.
Robert, why don't you take over? I'm afraid I'm going to be overwhelmed here.
Okay, Danielle.
So I have a question going back to the timeline. We talked about the U.S. part, but there are 11 more partners, right?
Mm-hmm.
Has anybody ratified? Kind of, what does the rest of the world look like in terms of when this might happen, or if the U.S. doesn't sign on, does the whole thing dissolve, or what's the story?
My understanding is that most folks are waiting on us. That if the U.S. isn't going to sign on, then there's no reason for, if Malaysia doesn't get access to the U.S. market, forget about it. If Vietnam doesn't get access to the U.S. market, then it doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody signing on. It was just signed last month, so I think we're still pretty early in the game.
This goes back to ISDS, but I'm just wondering, if it's so controversial, why can't we just settle it by saying, you know what, you corporations, you businesses, why don't you buy insurance? If you think you're going to be expropriated, if you think you're going to lose your investment, then buy insurance. That's my question.
A lot of them do buy insurance. They buy political risk insurance. For smaller investors, it's not an option. It's too expensive. It means that they won't invest. It's a barrier to entry. So for the large multinationals, they already do it. For those who don't do it, it's largely because they can't. So that's the answer.
So if they have insurance, why do they need ISDS?
Because political risk insurance doesn't always cover every contingency that you have. I mean, if you've ever tried to collect on an insurance policy of any type, right? Like I'm battling some insurance agencies right now. Right, yeah. I mean, they will find whatever exclusion they can find to keep you from collecting on your insurance policy. So you never actually get what you thought you bought. So there's also, you don't necessarily, like any other insurance, you don't necessarily want to call in your policy on that either. Now, I think it's OPIC, the Office of Overseas Private Investment Corporation, will subsidize political risk insurance for some U.S. companies to do business in certain developing markets that we don't have a bilateral investment treaty with, where we don't have ISDS, where we otherwise don't have access to the rule of law. OPIC will subsidize the political risk insurance there. So that helps in some countries, but not the ones we're talking about with the TPP.
So the question is, what about the intellectual property chapter, those requirements in the TPP? Won't change much in the United States. So the United States already has on its books what we call the TRIPS Plus standards in pharmaceuticals. And what that essentially means is it gives pharmaceutical companies a lot of machinery to extend their patents and to diminish the rate at which we get generic competition here. That's already there, and TPP is not going to change that in any way. So if the question is about what I think the impact is going to be in the United States, I would say minimal, which doesn't mean the impact of our policy is something I would agree with generally. But it could have some substantial impacts over time in Vietnam, Malaysia, some of the developing countries, where, again, read the chapter, it'll put you to sleep, but you have to understand the technical aspects of what is being required there. I'll just give you one example. that will, I think, make the case, and it isn't in pharmaceuticals. If you want to talk about that, we can. The TPP, for the first time, criminalizes trade secrets espionage in a trade agreement, which is to say all trade agreements we've had before, if there was a local company that was stealing your trade secrets, then there could be some fines and some civil penalties and so on. But now, as a matter of policy in all of these countries, and this is aimed at China more than anyone else if China joins, then whether it's state-sponsored or not state-sponsored, stealing trade secrets by hacking somebody's laptop, it will be both a civil and a criminal penalty. And you can ask yourself whether that's good or bad. I mean, it's a good thing for companies here in the United States who don't want to take their laptops off to China because they think they're going to lose their trade secrets. But taking some small company and putting its executives in jail for something that has never been criminalized before strikes me as really going beyond the pale. So that's a part of the TPP that I have real concerns about.
Is that at all related to like knockoff products?
Well, that's about what we call counterfeiting. So just taking somebody's trademark and making your own version. There are already lots of rules about that throughout the world. I don't think TPP makes much difference there. It increases the criminal penalties some. But where the thing makes new ground is in trade secrets. It's in this biologics protection and pharmaceuticals. And it's in some of the digital rights protection stuff that isn't right now in the law in a lot of Asian economies. So it makes life much easier for the intellectual property exporters from the developed world. But these days, if you're going to get a trade agreement, you got to have those people on your side. That's for sure. So there's no way to get these agreements otherwise.
Please join me in thanking the panel for this really great discussion.